The water came without warning, rushing through Lucinda Turner's valley, homestead, with the force of 100 stampeding horses. She had just enough time to grab her father's watch and flee to higher ground before the entire property, her childhood home, her livestock, her carefully tended garden disappeared beneath the churning waters of the swollen river. As she stood on the ridge overlooking what had once been her life, Lucinda felt as hollow as the abandoned wasp nest she'd once found in her barn rafters. Empty, fragile, ready to crumble at the slightest touch. It was May 1873, and the spring rains had been relentless across western Nebraska. The usually manageable North Platte River had transformed into a monster, devouring everything in its path, including her future. Lucinda shivered in the morning air, watching as the last corner of her roof disappeared beneath the murky water. At 22, she was now completely alone. Her parents had passed 3 years prior, victims of an influenza outbreak that had claimed a dozen souls in Marysville. She had managed the small ranch by herself since then, determined to honor her father's hard work and her mother's dreams. Now it was all gone. "Miss, you all right?" The deep voice startled her, and Lucinda turned to find a tall figure on horseback approaching from the eastern trail. The rising sun silhouetted him, making it impossible to see his features, but the broad-brimmed hat and easy posture in the saddle marked him unmistakably as a cowhand. "Do I look all right?" she snapped, instantly regretting her tone. It wasn't his fault the river had risen. He dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his chestnut gelding closer. As he approached, she could see him clearly, tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of fresh coffee. His face was angular but not harsh, weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than 30. "No, madam, you surely don't," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm Zeke Norwood. I work at the Flying W just north of town." "Lucinda Turner," she replied automatically, turning her attention back to the flooded valley. "This was my place. Look at it. Everything's gone." Her voice cracked on the last word. Zeke stood beside her, surveying the devastation. His silence was oddly comforting. He didn't try to offer empty platitudes or false hope. After several minutes, he spoke. "Then we'll build something new together." Lucinda turned, certain she'd misheard him. "Pardon." "I said," he repeated, meeting her eyes directly, "then we'll build something new. Water's got to recede eventually. Land'll still be there." She questioned, arching an eyebrow. "I don't recall requesting your assistance, Mr. Norwood." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "No, you didn't. But I'm offering all the same. Nobody should face this kind of trouble alone." Before she could respond, he continued. "My boss sent me to check the river crossing. When I saw your place going under, I came looking for survivors." He glanced at her muddy dress and bare feet. "You need help, Miss Turner, whether you want to admit it or not." Lucinda opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. He was right. She had nowhere to go, no clothes beyond what she wore, and precisely $3.17 in her pocket. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I appreciate your concern," she said finally, "but I don't see how. For now, you need a place to stay," he interrupted. "Mrs. Holloway at the boarding house in town has a kind heart, and once the water recedes, I can help you salvage what's left, rebuild what isn't." "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why would you help a stranger?" Zeke's gaze drifted to the flood waters before returning to her face. "7 years ago, I lost everything in a fire. My family's ranch in Wyoming, my parents, my brother." His voice remained steady, but she saw the old pain in his eyes. "A stranger helped me. Gave me work, a place to stay, taught me to live again." He shrugged. "Seems only right to pass that kindness along. Lucinda studied him, searching for any hint of deception. Finding none, she nodded slowly. "I don't have much choice, do I?" "There's always a choice," he replied. "But some are better than others." He gestured toward his horse. "You can ride. I'll walk beside you into Marysville." "I couldn't." "You can and you will," he said firmly. "Those bare feet won't take you 6 steps on the rocky trail." Too exhausted to argue further, Lucinda allowed him to help her mount. As they began the journey to town, she clutched her father's pocket watch, the only thing she had managed to save, and tried not to think about the uncertain future stretching before her. Marysville had grown considerably in the 6 years since the Union Pacific Railroad had established a station there. What had once been little more than a trading post had blossomed into a proper town with nearly 300 residents. Main Street boasted a general store, 2 saloons, a small hotel, and various other businesses catering to both locals and those passing through on the Great Iron Road to the west. The streets were busier than usual that morning, with townspeople gathering to discuss the flood and its implications for the surrounding farms and ranches. Heads turned as Zeke led his horse down the center of town, with Lucinda perched uncomfortably in the saddle. "Mrs. Holloway's boarding house is just ahead," Zeke told her, pointing to a 2-story white clapboard building with green shutters. "Best cooking in 3 counties, too." As they approached, the front door opened, and a plump woman in her 50s hurried onto the porch. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her apron was dusted with flour. "Zeke Norwood, what brings you to town on a Tuesday?" she called, wiping her hands. Her smile faded when she noticed Lucinda. "Oh my, what's happened?" "Morning, Mrs. Holloway," Zeke greeted her. "This is Miss Lucinda Turner. Her homestead was taken by the flood. She needs a place to stay and some proper clothes." Mrs. Holloway's face immediately filled with sympathy. "You poor dear. Of course you'll stay here. Come in, come in." Zeke helped Lucinda dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "I'll check with the general store about relief supplies," he told her. "The railroad often donates goods when there's trouble." Lucinda suddenly felt overwhelmed by this stranger's kindness. "Mr. Norwood, I don't know how I'll repay you." "You don't need to," he said simply. "Just rest. We'll figure out the next steps tomorrow." Mrs. Holloway ushered her inside, clucking sympathetically about the flood and promising hot food and a warm bath. Lucinda allowed herself to be led upstairs to a small but clean bedroom with a patchwork quilt and curtains that matched the green shutters outside. "Now, you get out of those wet things," Mrs. Holloway instructed. "I'll bring up some clothes that might fit you. My niece left some things behind when she married last year. About your size, I'd say." Left alone, Lucinda sank onto the edge of the bed. The events of the morning felt unreal, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. Just yesterday, she had been planning her garden, worrying about her 2 milk cows, and hoping the chicken coop would survive another season without repairs. Now it was all gone, and she was dependent on the charity of strangers. She opened her hand and looked at her father's watch. The gold case was scratched but intact, the glass face unbroken. She ran her thumb over the engraving on the back. "To Jonathan, with love eternal, Margaret." Her mother's gift to her father on their 10th anniversary. The timepiece still ticked steadily, marking the passage of minutes in a world that had suddenly changed beyond recognition. Mrs. Holloway returned with a bundle of clothing and news that a bath was being prepared downstairs. "Mr. Norwood asked me to tell you he'll return tomorrow morning. Says he needs to report back to his employer but will be back to help you sort things out." "He's very kind," Lucinda said. "One of the good ones," Mrs. Holloway agreed. "Lost his family some years back, from what I understand. Doesn't talk about it much." She set the clothes on a chair. "Now, Come down when you're ready. You need food in you." Later, after washing away the mud and changing into a borrowed dress that was only slightly too large, Lucinda sat in Mrs. Holloway's kitchen, forcing herself to eat despite having no appetite. Other boarders, a schoolteacher, a clerk from the railroad office, and an elderly gentleman who repaired watches and clocks expressed their sympathies and offered what help they could. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, Lucinda finally allowed herself to cry. Silent tears at first, then deep, racking sobs that she muffled with the pillow. She cried for her lost home, for the garden her mother had started and she had tenderly maintained, for the animals she hadn't been able to save. Most of all, she cried for the overwhelming sense that fate had once again singled her out for hardship, just when she'd finally found her footing after her parents' deaths. When the tears finally subsided, she felt hollow but somehow lighter. As she drifted toward sleep, her thoughts turned unexpectedly to Zeke Norwood, to the quiet strength in his manner, and the compassion in his dark eyes when he'd said those words that had seemed so preposterous at the time. "Then we'll build something new together." A promise from a stranger that somehow felt more substantial than the phantom remains of her homestead. It wasn't much to cling to, but for now it would have to be enough. True to his word, Zeke returned the following morning. Lucinda was helping Mrs. Holloway prepare breakfast when he knocked at the kitchen door, hat in hand. "Morning, ladies," he greeted them. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Mrs. Holloway said warmly. "Have you eaten? There's plenty. Already broke my fast at the ranch, thank you kindly." His eyes found Lucinda's. "How are you holding up, Miss Turner?" She managed a small smile. "Better, thank you. Mrs. Holloway has been very generous." "Nonsense," the older woman tutted. "It's what neighbors do," Zeke nodded. "Speaking of neighbors helping neighbors, I spoke with Mr. Reynolds at the general store. The flood affected several farms along the river. The town's organizing relief efforts. He set aside some clothes, boots, and basic supplies for those who lost their homes." "That's very kind," Lucinda said, "but I can't accept charity indefinitely. I need work." "One step at a time," Zeke advised. "First, let's see what can be salvaged from your property. The water's starting to recede already. I thought we might ride out there today if you're feeling up to it." Hope flickered within her. "Yes, I'd like that." An hour later, they were on horseback heading toward her homestead. Zeke had borrowed a gentle mare from the livery stable for Lucinda, insisting on paying the fee himself despite her protests. They rode mostly in silence, the spring sun warming the air around them. "May I ask what brought you to ranching, Mr. Norwood?" Lucinda finally asked, curious about this man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. "Zeke, please," he said. "And I was born to it. My father ranched in Wyoming, his father before him in Colorado. Norwoods have been working cattle since before the war. And now you work for someone else." A shadow crossed his face. "After the fire, I drifted for a while, took work where I could find it. Mr. Wallace, he owns the Flying W, gave me a permanent position 3 years ago. He's a good man. Fair employer. Do you like it there?" Zeke considered the question. "It's good work, good people." He paused. "But it's not mine. One day I hope to have my own spread again." "I understand that feeling," Lucinda said softly. As they crested the final ridge, Lucinda's heart sank. Although the water had indeed begun to recede, the devastation was even more apparent in the full light of day. Her small house stood partially collapsed, its foundation undermined by the rushing water. The barn was completely gone, as was the chicken coop. Debris, splintered wood, household items, parts of farm implements was strewn across the muddy landscape. "Oh," she breathed, the single syllable containing all her dismay. Zeke studied the scene carefully. "Foundations compromised on the house. not safe to salvage. But there might be personal effects worth recovering once the ground dries a bit more. The barn, downstream I expect, but the land itself is still here, Miss Turner. Good bottomland once it dries out. They dismounted and picked their way carefully closer to where the house stood. The smell of river mud and rotting vegetation hung heavy in the air. My mother's china cabinet was in that corner, Lucinda said, pointing. And my father's books, all his agricultural journals and notes. Zeke nodded. We'll search for them. Might be some things can be saved if we find them soon enough. They spent the next 2 hours carefully examining the wreckage, marking spots to return to when the ground was firmer. Zeke found a cedar chest that had been carried nearly 50 yards from the house, but remained intact. Its contents quilts made by Lucinda's grandmother, damp, but salvageable. Lucinda discovered her mother's cast iron cookware, which would need only cleaning and reseasoning to be useful again. By midday, they had compiled a mental inventory of what might be saved and what was certainly lost. It wasn't much, but it was more than Lucinda had dared hope for. We'll come back tomorrow with a wagon, Zeke said as they prepared to return to town. Bring some help, too. The Wallace boys are good workers, and Mr. Wallace already said they could assist. Why are you doing all this? Lucinda asked suddenly. Zeke looked surprised. I told you yesterday. No, she interrupted. I mean, yes, you mentioned someone helped you once. But this goes beyond repaying a kindness. You're investing your time, your resources. I'm practically a stranger. He was quiet for a long moment, adjusting his horse's saddle cinch. When I lost my family's ranch, he finally said, I lost my purpose along with it. Spent 2 years drifting, taking whatever work came along, drinking too much when no work was to be found. He straightened and met her eyes. The man who helped me, old Jacob Wheeler, he didn't just give me a job. He reminded me that having purpose is what keeps a person whole. And helping me gives you purpose. She couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. Helping someone who needs it is always worthwhile, he replied simply. Besides, I admire grit. You didn't fall apart when I found you, though you had every right to. Instead, you were standing there figuring out what came next. His mouth quirked up in a half-smile. That kind of backbone deserves support. Lucinda didn't know how to respond. His sincerity was disarming. After a moment, she simply said, Thank you. As they rode back to town, Lucinda found herself studying Zeke's profile against the blue Nebraska sky. There was something reassuring about him, a steadiness that seemed rare in a world that had proven itself all too unstable. The next day brought Zeke as promised, along with a wagon and 2 young men he introduced as the Wallace brothers, Tim and Sean, sons of his employer. They worked methodically through the day, salvaging what could be saved from Lucinda's property. By sunset, the wagon was loaded with the recovered items, far more than she had expected, though still only a fraction of what she had owned. Where should we take these things? Tim Wallace asked as they prepared to leave. Lucinda hesitated. She hadn't thought that far ahead. Mrs. Holloway has a storage shed behind the boarding house, Zeke suggested. She mentioned you're welcome to use it temporarily. Grateful for the solution, Lucinda nodded. As the Wallace brothers drove the wagon ahead, she and Zeke followed on horseback. I spoke with Sheriff Davies in town this morning, Zeke told her. He's keeping a register of properties damaged by the flood. The railroad company is considering compensation for affected landowners, especially those near their tracks. You might qualify. Hope sparked in Lucinda's chest. That would make all the difference. Don't count on it yet, he cautioned, but it's worth pursuing. When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway insisted they all stay for supper. The Wallace brothers accepted eagerly, and Zeke, after a moment's hesitation, agreed as well. The meal was lively, with the brothers telling stories of ranch mishaps that had everyone laughing. Lucinda found herself smiling more than she had in days. After the Wallaces departed, Zeke lingered on the porch. Lucinda joined him, wrapping a borrowed shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Thank you for today," she said. "For everything, really." "You're welcome." He stared out at the darkening street. "I'll be busy at the ranch the next few days. Spring branding is starting, but I was thinking, the mercantile is looking for help. Mrs. Reynolds mentioned it to me yesterday." "A job," Lucinda straightened. "At the general store. Temporary, I believe. But it would give you some income while you decide what to do about your land." Lucinda's mind raced. She had worked in her parents' home and on their small farm her entire life. The thought of standing behind a counter, interacting with townspeople all day, was intimidating. But she needed money, and this was an opportunity. "I'll inquire first thing tomorrow," she decided. "Thank you for letting me know," Zeke nodded. "Good, and I'll check in when I can. Maybe Sunday after church. I'd like that." As he turned to leave, Lucinda found herself reluctant to see him go. In the few days since the flood, his presence had become a steadying force in her upended life. "Mr. Norwood, Zeke," she corrected herself. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." He turned back, his expression serious in the fading light. "There's nothing to repay, Miss Turner." "Lucinda," she said softly. "Lucinda," he repeated, and the way he said her name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "You'll find your footing again, I have no doubt." With a tip of his hat, he was gone, his tall figure disappearing into the gathering dusk. Lucinda remained on the porch, contemplating the strange turn her life had taken, and the enigmatic cowboy who seemed determined to help her navigate it. The following morning, Lucinda visited Reynolds' general store. Mrs. Reynolds, a cheerful woman with apple-round cheeks and quick eyes, greeted her warmly. "Zeke mentioned you might be looking for help," Lucinda explained. "Indeed we are," Mrs. Reynolds replied. "Our usual assistant, young Mary Jenkins, is expecting her first child and finding the long hours on her feet difficult. We need someone to help with customers, stock shelves, and keep the ledgers in order. Can you cipher?" "Yes, madam," Lucinda nodded. "My father insisted I learn my figures properly, said a person who can't count will always be counted out." Mrs. Reynolds looked pleased. "Wise man, your father. Well then, when can you start?" "Immediately, if you'll have me." "Wonderful. Let's say 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We open at 8:30, so I'll have time to show you the ropes before customers arrive." As Lucinda left the store, her step was lighter than it had been since the flood. Employment meant income, and income meant options. Perhaps, in time, she could rebuild on her land after all. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Lucinda worked at the mercantile 6 days a week, learning the business quickly and earning Mrs. Reynolds' approval. On Sundays after church, Zeke would visit her at the boarding house, often bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, honey from the hives at the Flying W, once even a cutting from a rose bush that Mrs. Wallace had nurtured at the ranch house. "To plant when you rebuild," he'd said, presenting the carefully wrapped roots. They would walk through town together, sometimes venturing to the outskirts where they could see the distant mountains. During these walks, Lucinda learned more about Zeke's past, his childhood in Wyoming, the devastating fire that had claimed his family, his years of drifting before finding a place at the Flying W. In turn, she shared stories of her own life, her mother's gentle guidance, her father's stubborn determination to make their small farm thrive, her struggles and small triumphs in the years since their passing. June turned to July, and the summer heat shimmered across the Nebraska plains. Lucinda's land had dried completely, revealing bare earth where her garden had once flourished. On one Sunday afternoon, she and Zeke rode out to survey it properly. "The soil's still good," Zeke observed, crouching to examine a handful of earth. "Better, maybe, with the river silt deposited here." "But what should I do with it?" Lucinda asked. "I don't have the funds to rebuild completely, even with my wages from the store." Zeke stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. "What would you want to do if money wasn't an obstacle?" Lucinda considered the question seriously. "I'd rebuild, but differently. The house was too small and the barn too far from it. I'd plant an orchard over there." She pointed to the western edge of the property. "My father always talked about apple trees, but never got around to planting them." "That's a good plan," Zeke nodded. "Fruit trees take time to mature, but once they do, they're profitable. Less labor-intensive than row crops, too." "But it's all just dreaming," Lucinda sighed. "I'd need at least $500 to rebuild properly, and that's money I simply don't have." Zeke was quiet for a moment, his gaze scanning the horizon. "What if you had a partner?" Lucinda looked at him sharply. "A partner? Someone to share the investment, the work, the rewards." Her heart quickened. "Are you suggesting—" "A business arrangement," he said carefully. "For now. I've been saving for my own place. Have nearly $800 put by. Together, we could make something of this land." "But why would you invest in my property rather than purchasing your own?" He met her eyes directly. "Good land is hard to find at a fair price these days." "You already own this piece free and clear. It makes practical sense." "And that's all?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zeke's expression softened. "No, that's not all, but I respect you too much to presume." A warm flutter moved through Lucinda's chest. Over the past weeks, she had found her thoughts turning to Zeke more and more frequently, wondering what he would think of a particular customer's request at the store. Looking forward to their Sunday conversations, feeling a distinct disappointment on the rare occasions when ranch work kept him from town. "I would need to think about it," she said finally. "A business partnership is a serious commitment." "Of course," he agreed. "Take all the time you need, the offer stands." As they rode back to town, Lucinda was acutely aware of Zeke's presence beside her. A partnership. The word seemed inadequate somehow. A pale shadow of the possibility that was beginning to form in her mind and, she suspected, in his as well. That evening, after Zeke had returned to the ranch, Lucinda sat in her room at the boarding house, making calculations in a small notebook. If they combined resources, they could indeed rebuild the house and barn before winter. With careful management, they might even have enough left to plant those apple trees in the spring. But a business partnership with Zeke would mean binding her future to his in a significant way. What if they disagreed about how to develop the property? What if one of them wanted to sell their share? What if? What if the growing warmth she felt in his presence was merely gratitude, not the beginnings of something deeper? Lucinda closed her notebook and moved to the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. When had Zeke Norwood become so important to her? When had his opinions, his approval, his smile become things she actively sought? She didn't have clear answers, but she knew one thing with certainty. The thought of rebuilding her life without him in it left her feeling hollow in a way that even the flood hadn't managed. The next morning brought unexpected news. As Lucinda arrived at the general store, she found Mrs. Reynolds in an excited conversation with her husband and Sheriff Davies. "Oh, Lucinda, there you are," Mrs. Reynolds called. "Have you heard? The railroad company has announced compensation for flood-affected properties. Sheriff Davies has the details." The sheriff, a tall man with an impressive mustache, tipped his hat to Lucinda. "Miss Turner, yes, the Union Pacific has established a relief fund. Properties within 1 mile of the tracks that suffered flood damage are eligible for payments. Your homestead falls within that boundary. How much? Lucinda asked, hardly daring to hope. Based on the assessment of damage, you'd be entitled to $300. Not enough to replace everything, I know, but it should help. $300. Combined with her savings from the store, she would have nearly $400. Still not enough to rebuild properly, but suddenly Zeke's proposal seemed even more viable. When would the payment be made? She asked. They're processing claims now, the sheriff replied. I'd estimate 2 to 3 weeks. You'll need to sign some papers at my office when you have time. Throughout the day, as Lucinda helped customers and restocked shelves, her mind kept returning to Zeke's offer and this new development. By closing time, she had made her decision. Sunday couldn't come quickly enough. When Zeke arrived at the boarding house after church, Lucinda was waiting on the porch. I've been thinking about your proposal, she said without preamble. Zeke's expression remained neutral, but she noticed how his posture tensed slightly. And the railroad is offering compensation for flood damage, $300. That's good news, he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. Yes, it is. It means I could rebuild on my own in a modest way. A shadow crossed his face. I see. But I don't want to, Lucinda continued. I've thought about it carefully, Zeke. I want a partner. I want to build something new, something better than what was there before, and I want to do it with you. The tension left his shoulders, replaced by a cautious hope. Are you certain? It's a big commitment. I am, she said firmly. But I have conditions. Name them. First, we put everything in writing, a proper contract drawn up by a lawyer. Second, we make decisions together as equals. And third, she hesitated, then pushed ahead. Third, we both understand that this is, for now, a business arrangement. Anything else that might develop between us should be separate from our business dealings. Zeke studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes serious. Those are fair conditions. I agree to all three. A smile slowly spread across his face. Partners, then. Lucinda extended her hand. Partners. Instead of shaking it, Zeke gently took her fingers and raised them to his lips in a gesture that sent warmth cascading through her. I believe this calls for a celebration, he said. Will you join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant? I hear they're serving roast beef today. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Marysville, and Lucinda had never dined there. I'd be delighted. That evening, seated across from Zeke in the small but elegant dining room, Lucinda felt a sense of rightness settle over her. They discussed plans for the property, where to position the new house, how large to make the barn, whether to add a dedicated chicken house or a separate storage building first. We should name it, Zeke suggested as they shared an apple pie for dessert. Name what? Our ranch. Every proper ranch needs a name, our ranch. The phrase sent a pleasant shiver through her. What do you suggest? Zeke considered for a moment. How about the new beginning? That's what it is after all. It's a bit on the nose, don't you think? Lucinda laughed. Perhaps something more distinctive. The riverside, she shook her head. After what that river did, I think not. They traded suggestions back and forth, each more outlandish than the last, until finally Zeke snapped his fingers. I have it. The Phoenix Ranch. Phoenix. Like the mythical bird, exactly. Rising from the ashes, or in our case from the flood waters, creating something new and stronger. Lucinda rolled the name around in her mind. The Phoenix Ranch, I like it. Then it's settled, he grinned. The Phoenix Ranch it is. As they walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, Lucinda felt a newfound confidence in her future. The flood had taken everything, yes. But from that devastation, something unexpected and promising had emerged. Zeke escorted her to the boarding house steps, then hesitated. I almost forgot, I have something for you. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her palm. It was a seed, a single apple seed. For our first orchard tree, he explained. A symbol of what we're starting. Lucinda closed her fingers around the tiny seed, deeply touched by the gesture. Thank you. In the silvery moonlight, his features seemed both softer and more defined. He was handsome, she realized with a little start. Not in the flashy way of some men, but in a steady, enduring manner that grew more apparent the longer one knew him. Good night, Lucinda, he said softly. Good night, Zeke. As she watched him walk away, the apple seed warm in her hand, Lucinda acknowledged the truth she'd been dancing around for weeks. She was falling in love with Zeke Norwood. And if she wasn't mistaken, he was falling in love with her too. The following weeks were a flurry of activity. Zeke arranged for the legal partnership agreement to be drawn up by a lawyer in North Platte, and they both signed it in the presence of Sheriff Davies. The railroad compensation came through as promised, and with their combined funds, they began purchasing materials for the new buildings. Lucinda continued working at the general store, though she gave notice that she would be leaving at the end of August to focus on the ranch. Mrs. Reynolds was understanding, even offering to extend credit for any supplies they needed for the rebuilding effort. Zeke spent his days off from the Flying W clearing the homestead site and marking the foundations for the new structures. He'd arranged with Mr. Wallace to reduce his duties at the ranch, explaining his new partnership with Lucinda. The older rancher had been supportive, even offering the loan of tools and occasional help from his sons. By mid-August, construction was well underway. The foundation for the new house had been laid larger than the original, with a proper stone cellar underneath. The barn frame was up, awaiting roof beams and siding. Lucinda and Zeke worked side by side whenever possible, learning each other's rhythms and preferences, occasionally disagreeing but always finding compromise. On a warm Saturday evening, they sat on the partially completed porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. They had worked since dawn, and exhaustion weighted their limbs, but there was satisfaction in seeing the day's progress. The roof beams should arrive on Tuesday's train, Zeke said, stretching his shoulders. With luck, we'll have the barn roofed before the first autumn rains. And the house, October, I think. Sooner if we can get more help. Lucinda nodded, mentally adjusting their timeline. I should speak with Mrs. Holloway about extending my stay at the boarding house. Or, Zeke began, then hesitated. Or, he turned to face her, his expression earnest. Lucinda, these past months working with you have been the happiest I've known in years. I know we agreed this was a business arrangement, but I think we both know it's become more than that. Her heart quickened. Yes. I'm not a man for flowery speeches, he continued, but I know what I want, and that's a life with you, not just as business partners, but as husband and wife. Though she had sensed this moment approaching, the reality of it still took her breath away. Are you proposing, Zeke Norwood? Inelegantly, but yes. He reached for her hand. I love you, Lucinda. I think I started falling for you that first day when you stood on that ridge looking at all you'd lost with your chin still high. Tears pricked at Lucinda's eyes. I love you too. Then marry me. We'll build this place together, truly together. The house, the barn, the orchards, they'll be the foundation of our life, not just our livelihood. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, I'll marry you. Zeke's smile was radiant as he leaned forward to kiss her, a gentle meeting of lips that quickly deepened into something more passionate. When they finally parted, both breathless, Lucinda rested her forehead against his. When? She asked. As soon as possible, he replied. Before the house is finished, even. We can stay in town until it's ready. Mrs. Holloway would have opinions about that arrangement, Lucinda laughed. Then we'll get married next Sunday, Zeke decided. I'll speak with Reverend Thomas tomorrow, unless you want to wait for a bigger celebration. Lucinda thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. No, a simple ceremony is fine. What matters is beginning our life together. As darkness fell around them, they remained on the porch, planning their future with the easy confidence of two people who had already faced significant hardship and emerged stronger for it. True to his word, Zeke spoke with Reverend Thomas the next day. The minister was happy to perform the ceremony the following Sunday, and word quickly spread through Marysville about the upcoming wedding. Mrs. Holloway insisted on hosting a small reception at the boarding house afterward, and Mrs. Reynolds closed the store early so she could attend. On her wedding day, Lucinda wore a new dress, pale blue cotton with delicate white embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Mrs. Holloway had helped her style her hair, arranging the chestnut waves with small white flowers woven throughout. As she waited in the church anteroom, Lucinda felt a curious blend of nervousness and absolute certainty. "Your parents would be so proud," Mrs. Holloway said, adjusting the flowers one last time. "You faced terrible loss with such courage, my dear." "Thank you for everything," Lucinda replied, embracing the older woman. "You've been like family to me these past months." "And I'll continue to be," Mrs. Holloway assured her. "Now, I believe there's a very handsome cowboy waiting for his bride." The ceremony was simple but meaningful. Zeke, dressed in a new black suit and white shirt, watched Lucinda walk down the aisle with undisguised adoration. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and confident in the small church. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the gathered townspeople erupted in cheers and applause. The reception at the boarding house was a joyful affair, with food contributed by many of the businesses in town. Mr. Wallace and his sons attended, presenting the newlyweds with a fine team of draft horses for the ranch. Sheriff Davies brought a handcrafted rocking chair for the new house's porch, and Mrs. Reynolds gifted them with a set of china dishes. As the celebration continued around them, Zeke led Lucinda outside for a moment of quiet. "Mrs. Norwood," he said softly, testing the name. "I like the sound of that," she smiled. "I have something for you." He withdrew a small velvet pouch from his pocket. "I wanted to wait until we were officially married." Lucinda opened the pouch to find a gold ring with a small but brilliant diamond. "Zeke, it's beautiful." "It was my mother's," he explained as he slipped it onto her finger. "The only thing I managed to save from the fire. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person to wear it again." Tears welled in Lucinda's eyes. "I'll treasure it always." Zeke kissed her tenderly, then rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd find happiness again after losing my family. Never thought I'd have a home that truly felt like home. The flood took everything I had," Lucinda whispered, "but it led me to you. Perhaps some losses opened the door to greater blessings." "The Phoenix Ranch," Zeke nodded, "rising from devastation to something better than before. Our new beginning." They returned to the reception hand in hand, surrounded by the community that had supported them through hardship and now celebrated their joy. The future stretched before them, not without challenges certainly, but full of promise and purpose and, most importantly, love. By early November, the house was complete enough to be habitable, though some interior finishing work remained. Zeke and Lucinda moved in on a crisp autumn morning, bringing their few possessions and many hopes for the future. The barn was finished as well, housing their team of draft horses and a milk cow gifted by the Wallaces as a wedding present. Their first winter as husband and wife was one of cozy intimacy and hard work in equal measure. They completed the interior of the house room by room, hanging curtains Lucinda had sewn, building furniture from locally milled lumber, planning spaces for the family they hoped to have someday. When spring arrived, they planted the apple orchard Lucinda had always wanted, starting with a special spot for the tree that would grow from the single seed Zeke had given her. They added chickens, a few pigs, and began breaking ground for crops. By their first anniversary, the Phoenix Ranch was becoming everything they had envisioned and more. The buildings gleamed with fresh paint, animals grazed in fenced pastures, and the young orchard showed promising growth. Most importantly, Lucinda and Zeke had built not just a ranch, but a true partnership based on mutual respect, shared dreams, and deepening love. On a warm September evening in 1874, they sat together on the porch swing Zeke had built, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. Lucinda's hand rested protectively over her slightly rounded belly where their first child was growing. "What are you thinking?" Zeke asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "About how much can change in 16 months, she replied. "Last May I thought my life was over. Now—" She gestured to the thriving homestead before them. "Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible." Zeke covered her hand with his own, feeling the slight movement of their unborn child. "We built something new together, just like I promised." "Yes," Lucinda agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "Something far better than what was lost." As darkness settled over the Phoenix Ranch, they remained on the porch, content in each other's company and in the knowledge that, from the devastation of the flood, they had indeed created something beautiful and enduring: a home, a future, and a love strong enough to weather whatever storms life might bring. 5 years later, the Phoenix Ranch was barely recognizable from the flood-ravaged land Lucinda had stood upon that fateful day in 1873. The house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. The barn was full of healthy livestock. The apple orchard was beginning to produce fruit, and fields of wheat and corn stretched across acres that had once been underwater. Lucinda stood on the porch, watching her 4-year-old son James chase butterflies in the front yard while baby Elizabeth napped in her cradle nearby. At 31, Lucinda felt a contentment that permeated every aspect of her life. Her children were healthy, the ranch was prosperous, and her marriage to Zeke had only deepened with time. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road, where Zeke was returning from town. James abandoned his butterfly chase to run toward his father, squealing with delight when Zeke swung down from the saddle and swept him up into a hug. "Were you good for your mama today?" Zeke asked, carrying the boy toward the house. "Yes, sir," James nodded vigorously. "I helped feed the chickens and didn't chase them at all." "That's my boy," Zeke laughed, setting him down to greet Lucinda with a kiss. "Any news from town?" she asked, noting the leather satchel he carried. "Actually, yes." His expression was serious, but his eyes sparkled with suppressed excitement. "Mr. Wallace is retiring, moving to California to live with his daughter." "Oh, what will happen to the Flying W? He's selling it. And he's offered us first chance to buy the northern section, the part that borders our land to the east." Lucinda's eyes widened. "But that's nearly 800 acres. How could we possibly afford it?" "I've been saving more than you know," Zeke said. "And with the profits from this year's crops and the apple harvest, we could manage it, especially if Wallace will accept payments over 5 years, which he's indicated he would." "Expanding the ranch has always been your dream," Lucinda said, studying his face. "Our dream," he corrected. "But only if you want it to. We decide together, remember." Lucinda thought of the lonely young woman she had been, standing on the ridge watching everything she owned disappear beneath the floodwaters. How impossible it would have seemed then to envision the life she now lived with a loving husband, beautiful children, and a thriving ranch. "The phoenix keeps rising," she murmured. "What's that?" She smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I said yes. Let's do it. Let's expand the Phoenix Ranch." Zeke's answering smile was brilliant. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off her feet in an exuberant embrace that made James giggle and Elizabeth wake with a startled cry. "Sorry, little one," Zeke chuckled, setting Lucinda down so she could retrieve their daughter from the cradle. He gazed at his family, his wife cradling their baby girl, his son tugging at his pant leg for attention, and felt a profound gratitude that defied words. "I love you," he said simply to Lucinda. "All those years ago, when I told you we'd build something new together, I never imagined it would become something this wonderful." Lucinda leaned against him, their children between them. "Neither did I. But that's the beauty of new beginnings, isn't it? You never know just how magnificent they might become." As the sun began to set over the Phoenix Ranch, casting long golden shadows across land that had once been devastated, but was now abundant with life and promise, Zeke and Lucinda Norwood stood together on the porch they had built with their own hands, surrounded by the family they had created with their love, secure in the knowledge that whatever the future might hold, they would face it together, just as they had from the moment a flood had washed away everything but possibility.